Hello and welcome to Star Citizen Sunday. This is a weekly show which covers all the news from Star Citizen from the week just past. I am your host Mac, so let's get on with it. So this week we see Chris Roberts choosing some fauna. We see how the outfits for Orison Crusaders Landing Zone are concepted, plus Sean Tracy answers our questions regarding theatres of war. So this week inside Star Citizen kicked off with a look into the planning week, which happens at the beginning of every new year. Now this is where people from all departments come together to review the previous year and work with the producers to formulate the intended direction for the year to come. This show in particular spoke to many of the producers to find out what they do and why the planning week is essential. Producers basically organise the project to ensure everything works as smoothly as possible. Everybody talks between one another so that everyone knows what's happening and what direction they are heading. It's a way of communicating between all the teams and making sure everyone understands what everyone needs and requires and that we're all speaking from the same hymn sheet basically. Nothing really too interesting was heard in this section, so we'll move on to the Crusader concepts, where they spoke to Jeremiah Lee, one of the concept artists, about the process he goes through when it comes to creating a style for clothing for Crusaders residents. He needed to come up with something completely unique for the Crusader residents, but this brought challenges as there was no real starting point. Now they went through many different styles of outfits which they put to Chris Roberts, and he didn't really like most of them. They showed him some other concepts which he did sort of adhere to, which gave them a sense of direction that they want to go with. And so Jay Lee created some other looks in situ, giving us some incredible Crusader concept art, but also allowing them to see what it would look like around Orison, which is Crusader's landing zone. Chris suggested more of a colonial 1950s style. They went a little too 1950s, so they brought the style back into a more futuristic, sleeker look. And personally, I do like the look of this. It's a bit uniform, but I'm interested to see how it will look in actual game. Now, a couple of things to point out from this episode. Number one is that it looks like Chris Roberts is heavily involved and still has a clear vision of what he wants and will not compromise, which is one of the reasons why I have so much faith in this project, knowing that his vision is still there, which is great to hear, because a lot of people think he's just not involved as much. And number two is you can see actually a section of this where Jay Lee and Chris Roberts are selecting fauna, most likely to develop further, which could indicate that they are in the early stages of creating the animals and creatures that we will see inhabiting the verse. Do check out one of my earlier videos, which I have linked below, highlighting some of the animal concepts from which Jay Lee created. And it looks as though all these concepts are now pinned up on the wall where Chris Roberts is choosing from. With the development of the Stanton system is getting completed this year, it looks as though CIG will then move on to populating it with other things like fauna, locations, and other points of interest, which is good stuff. Anyway, that was inside Star Citizen. Let's move on. So this week's Star Citizen Live was pretty exciting. We had Sean Tracy talking about this Theatres of War game mode. Basically, it's a new Battlefield-esque game mode coming to Star Citizen pretty soon. It was shown off at CitizenCon. This was kind of a sit-down, answering our questions and just talking further about what it is and where it is now in development. It combines FPS, ground vehicles, air vehicles, and puts it all into a solid, safe environment to gather data and balance the game further. So it's kind of a test space for all the weapons, the armor, the ship vehicles, and the ground vehicles, the items, just to ensure that they are all balanced across the board, and it's very useful for the future of Star Citizen. Now this will eventually help to get each area of the game closer to what the PU experience will be like. For the persistent universe, it needs to be fun, and it cannot be as messy as it is now when they begin to up the player count. Now, it didn't take massive resources away from the building of the persistent universe and Squadron, as they just reused a lot of assets and the mechanics they already have. This obviously only focuses on the combat side of things. Obviously, there's a ton more things to do in the verse that are non-combat, and combat is just a small percentage of what we're going to be able to do in the final game, but they do need to have combat sorted, not just for Squadron 42, but for the PU as well. Now, he mentions that the CitizenCon feedback was really good. Some things he took away from that was how would orgs use this game mode, other Theatres of War modes as well, like capital ship versus cap ship, maybe in a Javelin or in a Driss taking over capital ships, so do expect to see something like that as a different scenario later down the line. Now, the focus is on fun, and this is the main piece of feedback that he received. We all know CIG are heavily focused on the graphics and fidelity and immersion, but what is definitely lacking at the moment in the game is actual fun. Obviously, this is quite difficult in an alpha when you're building 2 games on such a large scale, but it needs fun and it needs some structure. It also needs progression and the immediate engagement. Now, this is exciting to hear. Get it fun, then include the immersion and the fidelity. There's no reason why we can't have both. So I'm super stoked for Theatres of War. But anyway, let's get on with the questions and answers. First one being, what's being done to counter the lag, the hit registration, the rubber banding, and so forth? So, perfect question to start with. Now, Theatres of War is not separate from the game. It is the same game, using the same assets and engines, so it'll be affected by the same issues. But the benefit is, when they fix any issue here, or in Squadron, or in the PU, it goes across the board in most cases. Now, this is why Theatres of War is very important. It's difficult sometimes to notice issues in the PU because of how vast it is and how sporadic things happen, whereas when they started beginning to play Theatres of War, things like the hit registration was a major issue. And in a controlled environment like Theatres of War, they can assess it much quicker, much easier, and then get on with fixing it. So they have made significant improvements. The first one is the upstream refactor, which is coming in 4.0. It just means that the latency is much less and it feels more responsive. It won't do too much for the persistent universe right now until the server frame rates have increased, which is what they're doing with server-side OCS. So the biggest win that they say they have managed to do now is get the latency between the player, the client, and the server down to what was about, I think it was 250 milliseconds while it was at CitizenCon, but down to 120 and even as low as 50 milliseconds. Now, further to this, they can actually tune this in real time and change the latency time based on certain values. So it basically means when we get our hand on it, it will feel much better, much more responsive than what we're playing now. He did say they're hoping to get this latency fix in for about 3.9. He sounded confident when he said it, but obviously they don't want to say dates just in case. So I'm hoping 3.9, but it could be a bit later. It could be 4.0, maybe even later. So don't get your hopes up for that. But this is massive news, and it's going to be a huge win for all of us in the verse. Whether we get it for 3.9 or later, it doesn't matter. But let's get on with the questions and answers. I will probably bring a separate video about the whole latency thing later on. Next question is, will we get a bot mode in Theatres of War? And he says, yes, that would make lots of sense. They have it in Arena Commander for AI ship spawning, so there's no reason why they couldn't add it to Theatres of War. Now, I would love this just for practice, for training, for science, testing certain weapons and tactics where you're coming up with waves of AI. Next question is, where are we in development for Theatres of War? Now, they say they still want to get it out in the first half of this year, and they are very much on task. So that was what he said at CitizenCon. They've still got to get a couple of things into the Theatres of War, but they're not really huge systems. He wants to get it into our hands basically as soon as possible so that they can start gathering feedback and get us testing it. But right now, they are working on the friend stuff and some cinematic sort of briefing things so that you know where things are and where you're supposed to go. Next question is just basically destructible environments. Now, they say they have a few steps for this. The first one being getting 2D destructibles in, so glass, wood, things that can be penetrated, for example. From there, it'll be pre-made building pieces becoming destroyed, and then the final set of this is to be runtime destruction, which is coming a lot later. Next question is, what changes have you made to Theatres of War since CitizenCon? Now, there's been quite a few back-end stuff that needed to be brought in because 2 months before CitizenCon, they closed off their build so that nothing would affect it. So the first change they have brought into Theatres of War is Planet Tech version 4. So the planet looks so much better. Also, the physics refactor, which Chris Roberts has actually worked on himself, needed implementing, and server-side OCS, which doesn't really affect Theatres of War too much, but it's obviously needed because it's part of the mainstream. Building blocks is something they're currently adding in. And they also are currently adding in call-out, so giving the player an understanding of what is needed to do, like maybe go take this spawn point, or hey, the fight's in the other direction, where are you going? If you start running away from the actual battle. Now, it also sounds as though they've added a tram line, which is a way of getting people from, I think, maybe phase 1 to phase 2, so that if there's no vehicles available, you're not just running 3 kilometers, which I think would be pretty cool. They say they're going to kit it out with weapons and you can board this train, go from one point to the next while firing, which does sound quite interesting. Next question is, with it being 20 versus 20 players, When does the game start? Do you need a full lobby? And currently it's set to 8 people, so 4v4, and then the game will start, but they do need to gather more information on this. So it may change, it just depends on what feels right. Next question is, will other gameplay loops like medical or engineering be first introduced to Theatres of War? Now he says they're not going to be first introduced, as it's not the sort of drive environment for features. But if it does apply to Theatres of War and the game mode, then once the PU has it and it's okay, then they may bring it across to Theatres of War. But the PU is still the test bed. Next question is, does physicalized damage nullify the data gathering of ships right now? So it's a very good question. And no, it doesn't at all, Sean Tracy says, because the balancing of ships won't be so dissimilar to what they are now when the new damage system comes online. It'll just mean that the ships and vehicles will behave more as they're intended to. It'll affect gameplay a little as well, because your ships and vehicles just won't explode instantly. It'll be disabled, and then they will see what happens from there. So it sounds like it could be pretty cool, where you could be a fighter jet, you get taken down, but you don't explode, and you crash land, and then you've got to find your way back into the battle. You might crash over in enemy territory. I think there's a lot that could be done with this. So I'm excited, very excited for physicalized damage. Next question is, are the plans to test 100 plus players? And they say no plans right now, but they will happily test it once it's running well. Then they could start increasing the player count and see how that goes. Might not work so great in this Theatres of War scenario, as it is designed to be played 20 versus 20, but future scenarios, there's no reason why they can't have massive battles. Will Theatres of War help prioritize certain vehicles like the Nova tank, or Tonk? And he says yes, it'll help push prioritization. Like the Blister, for example, isn't really that much useful in the PU, but it's heavily useful in Theatres of War. So yes, certain vehicles that would be suited to these scenarios will definitely start coming much quicker. Someone asked if there will be maybe breaching gameplay planned, like hacking or your cutting tools or explosives. And yes, if the scenario makes sense for it, they will. They do need to rely heavily on the feature teams getting these assets into the PU first, and then they could create a mode that utilizes this technique. Maybe talking about the Idris versus Idris, or maybe boarding an Idris, you've got to breach somehow. So there's plenty of scope for it down the line, but nothing quite yet. Will you update the vehicles in Theatres of War as more vehicles come online? Now they say yes, they tried many vehicles and different loadouts. They will continue testing and see what works well. Also different vehicles, as I've said, for different scenarios. The Valkyrie will come back to Theatres of War, as it was heavily based around that, but only once they've made it less expensive as an asset. It was replaced with the hot plate, so it will make its return. But as different game modes come in, and maybe they could take maybe the Buccaneer, swap it out for a Sabre or for a Gladius, do stuff like that that will help balance each ship and each weapon. I think that would be a useful technique, but if it needs a different scenario, then I'm not going to argue. Now personally, I think Theatres of War is imperative to Star Citizen, as it kind of kills two birds. It gives us something that is really fun and allows us to have a completely different experience, like a quick, fast-paced action, which is not something we tend to get too much in the PU, so that will bring me back to playing it a lot more. But it also balances and brings a ton of stability to the verse as well, as problems become very apparent in such a small, controlled environment. So for me, Theatres of War is a massive win. I would love to hear more on Theatres of War, and I'm looking forward to getting into it and playing it myself. But that was Star Citizen Live. I'd love to know your thoughts. We may be discussing this over on streams recently. It's probably not going to go out in time for my next stream in an hour, but maybe another day. So do pop in and say hello. So also this week, there was a new lore post which appears to take place during the Second Taveran War. Plus, Jump Point is now available for all subscribers. So that brings us to the end of the show. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss a video. Hit that thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and share the video with all your friends. If you like what I do and want to help me make it better, follow the link below to my Patreon page to learn more.